We got a small group today. I know a lot of people couldn't make it, but what I thought we could talk about is how do we address anti-Semitism? We know that anti-Semitism exists. And we've talked about all the different causes of it. We've talked about the kind of roots in early Christianity, the Judaism emerging as, or Christianity emerging out of Judaism as the sort of younger brother or younger sibling religion, and that kind of sibling rivalry psychologically, the fact that for Christianity to exist and flourish in its early days, it had to denigrate Judaism, as this kind of replacement theology, that the new covenant has replaced the old covenant, also called supersessionism, which actually still exists as a theology, was officially rejected by the Catholic Church in the 1960s. They officially rejected the supersessionist theology, but it still exists in certain corners. Up through the Middle Ages, and really the vicious anti-Semitism of the Middle Ages, probably the worst period aside from the Holocaust, with the blood libel that Jews kill Christian children to use their blood to make matzah, the depiction of Jews as devils in Christian art, up to the expulsions from Europe in the 1300s and 1400s, and then the kind of rise of modern anti-Semitism, which we talked a little bit about, and it's hard to piece all these things together. Anti-Semitism is a difficult thing to write about because there's so many factors, but modern anti-Semitism is a kind of racial anti-Semitism. You want to think of it that way, and that really starts in the late 1900s or late 1800s, where the idea that Jews are not simply tainted by their religion, but are tainted by their blood, by their ethnicity, by their heritage, by their biology. And this argument, this is where actually the phrase anti-Semitism doesn't really exist until I think it's 1879 when it's used for the first time. But it was this idea, and there was a lot of things going on in modern science at the time. Eugenics, a study of body types, study of ethnicities. This was an era of nationalism and so forth. And the idea was that Jews are simply tainted by their mere existence. It doesn't even matter what they believe. It's in their blood. And that's sort of this modern racial anti-Semitism that really culminates in the Holocaust. And then a kind of shift happens even after the Holocaust, that now there's a new kind of anti-Semitism, which is kind of based on human rights in a way, sadly, a distortion of human rights. This idea that Jews are an oppressive, genocidal people, colonial people, bent on destroying Palestinians and importing Western culture into the Middle East and imposing their culture on indigenous peoples. This is kind of the modern kind of anti-Semitism. And that's where we are now. And all of these threads, it's not like, it's almost like, we're hearing these new mutations of a virus, but a mutation in a virus doesn't replace the old virus, right? Delta still exists. And now Omicron or whatever it's not, that also exists. And this is kind of how anti-Semitism is. There is still racial anti-Semitism. There is still religious anti-Semitism, but there's a new variant essentially that has emerged over the last 20 years. And that's, maybe it's called political anti-Semitism because it exists really, Israel, the state of Israel is kind of the focal point, but all these types of anti-Semitism coexist. Now, ones are certainly more potent than the other, right? Certain variants of anti-Semitism are more potent in certain ages, right? Racial anti-Semitism culminated in the Holocaust, right? We hear, if your grandfather was Jewish, you're considered Jewish. I mean, Hitler didn't distinguish between practicing Jews and unobservant Jews. These variants all exist at the same time. There's still certain strands of religious anti-Semitism. There's political anti-Semitism in the Muslim world. So all these obviously coexist. There's kind of progressive anti-Semitism, leftist anti-Semitism, primarily in the United States, but also exists in France and so forth. So all of these are kind of coexisting. Then the question arises, what is the best way to respond? How do we respond to anti-Semitism? Well, let me give you kind of an overview of various potential responses, and then we can kind of discuss. So it used to be that what was considered the best response was education, was in some ways assimilation. If you look at sermons from the early 20th century in America, there was this idea that as more people meet Jews and see how Jews are, sophisticated and, speak well and dress well and are good Americans, belong to neighborhood associations, are essentially, as Jews assimilate and become part of the larger mainstream, that will increase acceptance, that will reduce anti-Semitism. This idea essentially that assimilation helps reduce anti-Semitism. You see that especially in a lot of the early Reform rabbis, early 20th century. You see this idea that interaction will diminish hatred. That's one strand, which obviously is untrue. I mean, maybe it does for some people, but obviously hate persists even with lots of interaction. Maybe on an individual level, sometimes it can reduce hostilities, but as a societal whole, Germany had plenty of Jews. It's not as if their people were ignorant about Jews. So assimilation and interaction can reduce anti-Semitism, but it doesn't necessarily. Another approach is education. The idea is that hatred is irrational, and hatred is the province of the uneducated. And if we can spread knowledge and a kind of better understanding of who Jews are to others, that should reduce anti-Semitism, right? The idea that hatred is a function of ignorance. This is kind of what the ADL believes. What other Jewish organizations promote is that the more knowledge, the more understanding, the less hate. Again, has that worked out all that well? Well, probably yes. I mean, yeah, in some ways that's true, right? As you learn more about Jews and Judaism, and you realize, I mean, there are probably people who still believe Jews, are devilish and engage in sacrifices and so forth. And if you educate people and they interact with Jews, and a church group comes and visits a synagogue and sees Jewish practice, maybe that does reduce hatred. But again, Germany in the 1930s was one of the most educated countries in the world. All the greatest institutions of higher learning were in Germany. University of Berlin, all these places were very, very educated populations, and yet still had the Holocaust. So education is important and something we should all support. Jews, obviously, we care deeply about education, but education doesn't seem to reduce anti-Semitism. In fact, sometimes some of the most educated people in the world are, Martin Heidegger, who is considered one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, was also a virulent Nazi. So, education doesn't necessarily reduce anti-Semitism. Another way of reducing anti-Semitism was political nationalism. Remember, one of the goals of the state of Israel, Theodor Herzl promoted this, was that when there's an Israel, that will reduce anti-Semitism because Jews will have their own state. In fact, Theodor Herzl was very audacious. He had a lot of chutzpah, and he actually would approach and set up meetings with virulent anti-Semites in Germany. He set up a meeting once with a Turkish sultan, who was a known hater of Jews. And he would say, look, you should support the existence of a Jewish state because you don't like Jews living in your country. So if you have a Jewish state, Jews won't live in your country and you'll be at peace. So Theodor Herzl, in many ways, saw Zionism, a Jewish state, as a way of reducing anti-Semitism, because the Jewish state would exist alongside other states. You don't like Jews? Fine. You don't have to visit Israel. And so this was part of the guiding ideology of Zionism, was that this would reduce anti-Semitism. It would also strengthen the Jewish spine in a way, right? There's this idea, and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, that in some ways, some of the early Zionists actually embraced anti-Semitic stereotypes. They believed that Jews were weak and were too urban and needed to return to the land. And there was something called muscular Judaism. There's muscular Christianity in early America, but this was a muscular Judaism, that we will return to the land and we become a stronger people. We'd become too intellectual, and now we are going to return to our core strength. By the way, that attitude still exists in Israel to an extent. Israel happens to be a very, I don't know how to say, how the right way to say it. It's sort of a masculine culture. Not that doesn't mean that there aren't very strong women. There are, but some of the qualities that are associated are generally, military generals are held in the highest regard in Israel, whereas obviously that's somewhat the case in the United States, but a different kind of culture around the military. So this was a kind of the idea that a political state would reduce anti-Semitism. The fourth way that people thought anti-Semitism would be reduced and addressed is economic. And this has always been a kind of vision, is that, a rising tide lifts all boats. When everybody's doing well, we hate each other a little less, right? The worst times in America, and this is somewhat true, by the way, this might be the most true or the most effective of the various approaches to anti-Semitism. The most effective might be economic. And the idea is that when everybody's prospering, nobody has reason to hate. That if you set up like the Oslo Accords, for example, in 1993, the Oslo Accords were signed between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. The idea was that Israel and Palestine would be like an economic bloc, kind of like the EU, the European Union. It would be a trade powerhouse. It would, export goods to the world, and people would prosper. And when people prosper, you get along better. And it failed, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But the vision behind it was that it would benefit everybody. And the early Zionists believed that when they set up factories and farms in Palestine, that would give jobs to people, and that people having jobs and prospering would be pretty good. Everyone would be happier. Everyone would be better off, get rid of the swamps and build a productive farm. And in some ways in America, one of the reasons American Jews have been largely free, I mean, there's of course anti-Semitism, but it's just a fraction of what it historically has been in Europe, is that the American economy has historically been very strong, that Jews have essentially been able to benefit from the rising economy. Unlike Blacks, unlike African Americans, who have not benefited as much, at least historically. Now it's a little bit different. But one of the famous examples is after after World War II, in the GI Bill, a lot of Jews were able to buy property in places like Highland Park, and build wealth that way, whereas African Americans could not. And so that's a whole nother story. But in general, the point I'm trying to get is that as American Jews prospered in America, that generally reduced anti-Semitism. If you're doing business with somebody, and you get along and you make a deal that benefits everybody, everybody's happy. Of course, there's still lingering anti-Semitism. I'm sure, there were probably elements. I don't know, Denny, you could probably tell, I'm sure there were elements in the auto industry. There were probably some historic pockets of anti-Semitism. There were other industries where there were historic pockets of anti-Semitism. Over time, though, this is the beautiful thing, over time, those tend to diminish. As people interact more economically, I remember, it's so funny, when I was in the city, they tried to, the people at the Union League Club tried to get me to join. And, I went there for lunch a couple of times. The food wasn't so good. The art is incredible, but I wanted to know the history. And somebody told me essentially what happened was the Union League Club did not have any Jews for a long time. But in the late 1990s, they were almost going to go bankrupt. They were in big trouble. And they said, we have to recruit more people to join the club. And they reached out to, wealthy, influential Jews in the city and tried to get them to join. And it worked to a degree. It brought in people. And so they had a deal, clergy, they a lot of the priests belonged there. It was like $50 a month or something, minimal kind of a fee. And so that's an example of in essentially an economic need reduced anti-Semitism to a degree. It brought more people together. So in some ways, Abraham Foxman, who is was the president of the ADL for a long, long time, he actually wrote a book about Jews and money. And he actually talked about how capitalism reduces anti-Semitism, that when people have free trade and the ability to build businesses and interact with each other, that ultimately, because it helps everybody, not equally, it doesn't help everybody equally, but it generally helps people improve their quality of life, that reduces anti-Semitism. I happen to think that may be the best, that's probably the most effective solution. It doesn't change everything. So we have, just to recap, we have kind of 4 potential areas of anti-Semitism or ways of addressing anti-Semitism. We have assimilation, the idea that Jews should just kind of become more like everybody else, and that will reduce hatred. That predominated in the early 20th century. A lot of Jews changed their names. A member of my guy I knew in the city, they were in the meat packing business. His original name was Bilski. It was changed to Billings. It worked. So there was certain anti-Semitism that you kind of assimilate, and that will reduce it. Second approach is educational. You teach people about Jews and Judaism. You go into schools. You visit small places where people have never met a Jewish person before, and that reduces anti-Semitism. This, by the way, worked. This strategy very much worked in gay rights. As people realized that they had family members and friends who were gay, that diminished persecution and kind of homophobia tremendously. So this is a strategy that can work. And it did work to a degree with Jews, but wasn't as effective. So you got education. Third, you've got political. The state of Israel was meant to address anti-Semitism. Fourth, you've got economic. That as Jews build businesses, as an economy grows, there's greater interaction, there's greater wealth, there's greater quality of life, and people get along better. A fifth one, forgot to mention this earlier, is legal. And this has actually been quite an important strategy in American Jewish history in addressing anti-Semitism, is the legal strategy. One of the whole idea of a separation of church and state, that generally was not true in America until the post-war period. So, I didn't grow up this way, but I imagine there may be some people on the call who grew up where there was maybe perhaps the Lord's Prayer was said in public school, or there was a Bible reading in public school. This was not uncommon, and it was legal. It was perfectly legal. It wasn't as if Jews were excluded, but a reminder of religion was, or really essentially Christianity was seen as the primary religion. There was a Supreme Court case in, I think it's 1947, 1948, in which public school buses were used to bring children from high school to church, and synagogues were used too for after-school religious training. And government money, public money, was used for these buses. There was a Supreme Court case that was sued, and the Supreme Court ruled that public money could not be used to transport students to a private religious organization. And that was the beginning. There were several other Supreme Court cases afterwards. That was the beginning of really this kind of very strict separation between church and state. By the way, there was a very famous case in 1991 as well. This because when I worked at the Religious Action Center, Reform Judaism, separation of church and state was one of my issues. So I really delved into this. In 1991, a rabbi in Providence, Rhode Island, was invited to give the invocation at a public high school graduation. He did. A Jewish family, sued the school for having a religious invocation at the ceremony. And it was a 5-4 decision in favor of that family. I don't know what the damages were. I don't know how it was settled, but essentially it was ruled that you cannot have a overtly religious invocation at a public ceremony. Now, I know that still happens, but I'm sure there are rules around what can be done and what can't. But the idea was that we should be as strict as possible in separating religion and public activities. And that was seen as a way of helping Jews, because essentially Jews are a tiny minority. And when, maybe not in Highland Park, obviously, but in most areas, Jews are a tiny minority. And so if we prevent religion from creeping into public institutions, that would help Jews, because that religion that creeps into public institutions is 99 times out of 100 going to be Christian. And so separation of church and state helps Jews. It also helps other minorities, obviously Muslims, any other religion is helped by that. Now, the interesting, and this has been a very effective strategy. However, it may not be as effective now as it once was, because American society is not nearly as Christian as it once was now. American society is mostly secular, especially the upper middle class, but it's not just me saying this. There are statistics that bear this out. For the latest Pew study, I think it was 2020, said for the first time in history, fewer than 50% of Americans attend church on a monthly basis. That has never dipped below 50% until this latest survey. So we are becoming a less religious society, even in parts of the South and so forth, where you would think that there was more religious practice, and there is more religion, but as a percentage, it is declining. So, but that being as it may, it is still seen as protective of Jews to have a strict separation between church and state, because it protects Jews from their religion being seen as secondary. And Jews have been very strong on this issue. Even, I remember when I was at the Religious Action Center, there were two issues that came up that were very interesting. One was, this was in 2000 and 2001, so right after George W. Bush was elected. And one of his early proposals, which ended up passing, I mean, this actually happened, but was to create this Office of Faith-Based Initiatives in the White House. And the idea was that, prison recidivism, where people go back to prison after being released from prison, there are some very effective solutions to prison recidivism and to reducing those rates, but they're mostly very religious. So Chuck Colson, from Watergate fame, who died, he started an organization. And essentially, these organizations try to turn ex-prisoners into evangelical Christians. And they work. I mean, it's actually very effective. It reduces the recidivism rate. And the idea was that government should fund these organizations because they work and they're much more effective than other organizations. And we said at the time, no, that is government funding religion. Even if it works, there's a principle that a government money should not be going to any organization that espouses a certain religion and that can discriminate on the basis of that religion. This is very important. So if a synagogue is looking for a rabbi, it is perfectly legitimate to say only Jews should apply for this job. Makes sense, right? It seems very logical. However, if a nonprofit, if a school board, if a school is looking for a new superintendent, they can't say only Christians should apply for this job or only Jews should apply for this job. They can't do that. That's illegal. That's employment discrimination. So religious organizations are exempt from employment discrimination laws. Rightfully so. I mean, however, if you take government money, you have to follow non-discrimination laws. So this creates a problem. If you are a faith-based organization and you say, we're only going to hire Christian counselors, and you are taking government money, that's illegal. And so that's why synagogues, that's why, by the way, we get a grant from the US government for security measures. That was somewhat controversial because we as a religious organization are getting federal money that's paid for by all taxpayers. There is a carve out for security situations, but there are some issues with that. So essentially, I'm getting a little bit off topic, but it's quite interesting, the laws about non-discrimination. But the idea is that public money that comes from everybody should not be given to organizations that discriminate, especially that discriminate on the basis of religion. Well, discriminate based on anything, but religion, certainly, the First Amendment. So that has been a part of a Jewish strategy for reducing anti-Semitism. And it's generally worked. However, that sort of, it's been chipped away at. The separation between church and state is kind of, if you think of a wall of separation, that wall has more and more chinks in it as laws change and so forth. I mean, obviously the Supreme Court, we're seeing a little bit of that right now. So we've gone over all those strategies. One more, which is something that I'm passionate about. And that other strategy is interreligious dialogue. The idea that as we work with people of different faiths, that reduces anti-Semitism. Chicago has a rich history of this. There's something called the Catholic Jewish Dialogue, which is still in existence, which was started with Cardinal Bernardine, which brought prominent Catholics and prominent Jews together. One of our members, Marshall Bennett, was very involved in, the late Marshall Bennett was very involved in this Catholic Jewish Dialogue. He used to tell me about it. But it was an idea, it was sort of a way of bringing together people of different religions and try to break down those barriers. And that really started with Vatican II. It still exists in every area. There are interfaith groups that come together, that learn together, that, we just had a Thanksgiving service with different churches in the area. We've had interfaith seders. This idea that we can interact with people of other faiths on a regular, ongoing, mutually beneficial basis. That has helped reduce anti-Semitism significantly. And by the way, this does not happen in other countries. It sort of happens a little bit in Great Britain, but in most other countries, there are very few interfaith groups. It's in somewhat an American phenomenon. And it has worked very well in America. And that is another strategy where as we interact more with people of different faiths, that can take a little bit of the edge off anti-Semitism, that Christians, as there's more education, fewer people will have the idea, for example, that Jews killed Jesus. So I got an email once from somebody who had read one of my books, and she had gone to church, and her pastor, I think it was somewhere in Tennessee, a small town, had gone to church, and the minister had given a sermon in which essentially he said the Jews killed Jesus. It wasn't an overtly anti-Semitic sermon. It wasn't like Jews killed Jesus, let's go get Jews now, but it was espousing this historic idea. And she said that she gave him a copy of my book, and he read it, and they had a wonderful discussion about it, and he changed his views. And so to me, I was like, that's a success. That in some ways, as we have greater interreligious dialogue and sharing and knowledge, that can reduce anti-Semitism. Obviously, it doesn't solve it, it doesn't eliminate it, but these are all various strategies. Okay, I covered a lot of ground. 6 different, but what do you think? What do you think works well? And can we ever, this is almost an existential question, difficult. Can we ever really eliminate anti-Semitism? Is it something that is essentially almost baked into human history? There are people who argue that anti-Semitism can never really be eliminated unless we essentially rewrite Christianity. Essentially say that, this is an argument made by Professor David Nierenberg at the University of Chicago, who wrote an extraordinary history of anti-Semitism. It's called Anti-Judaism. And he essentially says that anti-Semitism is baked into Western culture because Western culture is ultimately based on Christianity, and that anti-Semitism is baked into Christianity, and that we can educate, we can reduce, but we cannot. It'd be like taking the cornerstone of a building. You can't get rid of it. You can make it less potent, but you can't eliminate it. So my question to each of you, all of you, which strategies work in reducing anti-Semitism, and can we ever eliminate anti-Semitism? What do you think? I'd love to hear what you think. Barbara?
So I think that a couple of weeks ago, Joanne Bernstein wrote you a letter.
Yes.
The 4 of us were up in Door County. We went to a play where there was an anti-Semitic person called Anti-Semite, and it made fun of the anti-Semite. So we've all encountered things like that over the years. I don't know what strategy would solve that or even improve it, but what does a person do that comes upon a situation like that and we don't know how to handle it or what to do about it, or just sort of ignore it?
Remind me of what the play was. But I remember her email, and I remember writing back and saying, talk to the manager, but I know she did. But
she did. The play had various characters, and one was an anti-Semite, and one was a dead baby, and then there were others. It was a comedy, in quotes, and it was.
Oh, we lost you for a sec.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I was muted.
Please leave a message.
So, what does one do when they come upon something like that today?
This is a very interesting question. And in some ways, it's a little bit different since it's theater. In theater, sort of, the whole part of the idea is that we suspend belief for it's sort of a different world. It's kind of like going to see, I remember seeing the play, The Jew of Malta in fact, in London. And it's a hideously anti-Semitic play. Merchant of Venice, hideously anti-Semitic play, although one could argue that there are actually some I think that when it comes to theater, it's okay as long as there's some education that goes along with it. So if at the beginning of the play they had said, this play draws on some strong anti-Semitic stereotypes, we remind you it is theater and this is just meant, for effect or for comedic purposes. I personally am okay with that. I can see, though, that it is in some ways perpetuating certain anti-Semitic stereotypes. But isn't that kind of what comedy always does? Comedy is very difficult to draw a line in comedy. It's a fascinating, it's kind of like there was that famous Seinfeld episode where this dentist keeps making borderline anti-Semitic jokes. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, the dentist converts to Judaism. And Jerry is so upset because he said he converted just for the jokes, just so he could say the jokes without people thinking it's awkward. And so I think the point of that episode was that in some ways, comedy makes it very difficult to draw the line in the right place. And so I think that as long as there are some disclaimers and some awareness that this is drawing on certain stereotypes that are wrong, it seems okay. That's I think people could disagree with me, and maybe Joanne would disagree with that and say, the play should just not be performed ever. That's a potentially good argument too. I think when it comes to theater and artistic expression, you can have a little more latitude. That would be my take. What do you think?
I think that everyone around us was laughing and we weren't.
That's interesting. Well, yeah, Dork, that's very interesting. Now, were the people who were there, do you think it was mostly that you were the only Jewish people there?
Oh, for sure.
Oh, see, that's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, maybe it's especially important in that kind of environment to have more education, because if you go to like the Goodman Theater and they produce a play that has certain anti-Semitic stereotypes, people are going, or the Writers Theater, people are going to understand it. Maybe in a different kind of area, that's less okay. Again, it's so hard to draw this line. So hard. Other comments? What do you think? What do you think works in addressing anti-Semitism? And can we ever eliminate anti-Semitism? Is it just inevitable?
No.
Yeah, Bob, go ahead. Oh, unmute.
One thing I think you didn't mention is the role of government, which I think is extremely important. Germany was a very educated country, maybe the most educated country in the world, but they had a government system where, particularly when Hitler became the chancellor, that the government was on the side of anti-Semitism, in effect. In the United States, that's not the case.
Right.
Years ago, in the early, up to maybe the middle 1900s, there were many laws that in effect upheld discrimination against particularly Blacks, against many minorities, including Jews, the laws that upheld the inability to sell a home to a Jew because it's in a certain area. There was a deed restriction. Well, now the government, we even have a government official now who's in charge of Jewish relations and a relationship with the Jews and anti-Semitism. I mean, that to me is a tremendous difference, and something that I personally am hopeful that in many years I don't know if we'll eliminate anti-Semitism, but will diminish it tremendously. It's very hard to get rid of it entirely when you have these neo-Nazis. It's going to be hard to get rid of anti-Semitism in their mind, whether it has to do with religion or not. It's just the way they probably were brought up and where they think.
You're 100% right. I was trying to get at that in terms of the law, but it really is government. That yes, the fact that we are not in 1930s Germany right now. Even in 2016, when anti-Semitism really was really peaking during the election and so forth, we weren't even close to 1930s Germany, because at that point, the government was officially anti-Semitic. There are probably politicians who are anti-Semitic, but our system as a whole is not. And there are laws that essentially protect minorities. Employment, non-discrimination laws, fair housing laws. The law is an extraordinary tool in combating anti-Semitism. And that, by the way, that's why Jews really helped. Part of the success of the civil rights movement came from attorneys, many of whom were Jewish, who were addressing anti-Semitism as well as racism, that the laws that were put into place protected all minorities, and that the law can be an extraordinarily powerful tool to combat anti-Semitism, and that in a country that is, with a constitution. See, the interesting thing is, it's not just democracy that can prevent anti-Semitism, because democracy, if it was a pure democracy, majority rule can change everything. A majority could rule, hey, we don't like Jews living in our neighborhood, so we're going to vote to, let's say, we're going to vote, and a majority believes Jews should not live here, so Jews can't live here. That doesn't work. What works is a kind of constitutional system where there are certain bedrock principles, bedrock rights, and one of those rights being non-discrimination. And that's our system is built. Our system is not a pure democracy. It's a constitutional republic. And that constitution, of course, includes the Bill of Rights, and how we interpret that Bill of Rights, First Amendment being so critical, has been interpreted to protect all religious minorities.
That's what the Mississippi case that was argued today about Roe v. Wade is in effect about, because when you make an argument that the people of Mississippi should have the right to vote on abortions if in effect they want to get rid of them, that's an argument that is somewhat appealing. Let the majority rule. But on the other hand, you have certain fundamental rights that, like you said, rise over what the majority want. And that's the other side, the ones who want to uphold Roe v. Wade, are saying that there's certain fundamental rights. One is the woman's right to get an abortion, and that overrides the majority concern. In fact, if we just allowed everything up to the majority, you wouldn't need a fairly long constitution with all these rights. You just let people vote on what they want, but that's not how the government was set up.
Exactly. And yeah, and the question in this new Supreme Court case, and I think in general with Roe v. Wade, is what are those rights? What are they?
Is abortion one of those rights that majority can't take away?
Right. We should have a speaker come and talk. I found out a guy that, in fact, I beat him in the state debate championship when I was a senior. I beat him, and he was second place. But now he ended up a Rhodes Scholar, and he clerked for Justice Ginsburg. He clerked for Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and now he teaches at the University of Wisconsin Law School. And I'm going to send him an email and see maybe he could come give a talk on a Sunday morning about this issue, because he really, he's a professor of constitutional law, so this could be a really interesting talk, because I think there are a lot of similarities in this case between Judaism and American law, because I think, again, I'm of course not a lawyer, but the original Constitution had a limited number of rights that would be protected regardless of majority rule. But over time, those rights expand. That's sort of the nature of the American experiment in a way. And as far as I understand, Roe v. Wade is based on the right to privacy. Even though the right to privacy, there's nothing in the Bill of Rights that says right to privacy, but you can derive a right to privacy from the Fourth Amendment, illegal search and seizure, that you can out of these precedents, you can derive certain expansion of those rights. And that happens in Judaism. That, within Jewish law, there are ways where you derive further insights into how to live from earlier precedents. The Torah is sort of like the Constitution. And then the Talmud is kind of like the Federalist Papers. And then, the commentaries on the Talmud are like judicial decisions. You have a core and you build out from that core. But law, in fact, this is actually the fact that Jews are never mentioned, or even religion generally is never mentioned in the Constitution. That is actually a protection. Many early, we tend to think that the Magna Carta is the roots of Constitution lie in the Magna Carta. If you read the whole Magna Carta, there's a whole bunch of stuff about Jews in the Magna Carta, about how Jews had to pay extra taxes in England. And that's in the Magna Carta. Constitution never mentions Jews. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing that in some ways, nobody was singled out in America. America had a certain kind of equality. Now, it wasn't always like that in reality, but the law had the origins of the law did not see Jews as a different class of citizens. Okay, other comments, other questions. Can we ever eliminate anti-Semitism? And how else can we fight anti-Semitism? There's got to be more ways. Others?
I'll make a comment.
Yeah.
When one of our granddaughters was in 8th grade at Anti-Semitic day school, I heard the history teacher, the 8th grade history teacher, talking to parents and grandparents, and he was saying that he very strongly teaches anti-Semitism to the kids in 8th grade because Anti-Semitic does not have a high school. So these kids are going to go off to public high schools or other private schools, but not necessarily a Jewish school. And he feels that it's his responsibility for them to understand as much as they can about anti-Semitism. And his reason is because it is never going away. And that it's important for these kids to understand it and know how to respond to it. And the other thing I wanted to say is that when you talk about the Jewish-Christian dialogue as being a successful method, I'm thinking that we at Macomb have an excellent resource, and that's you, who is very involved in the Christian community for Jewish Christian relations. And this could maybe be a very excellent thing for us to have in our congregation, to have some groups of Jewish Christian dialogue. I know that we did this years ago. It might have been the late 70s or early 80s, that we had a small group that for, I don't know, a few months or maybe more, we had Christian Jewish dialogues with members of the church on Green Bay and Laurel. I forgot the name of the church. And it was very, very nice because we'd meet with the same groups and the same people, and you got to know them and respect them. And it was I thought, an important thing. The thing I specifically remember from that group is that when we talked about your children intermarrying, they didn't seem as upset about it as the Jews did, because for the Jews, it means if their child converts, it's accepting Jesus, which is really hard for a Jew to do. But for the Christians, when their kids would convert, it didn't bother them quite as much because the values were very similar. And if they had Jesus as an extra, that was fine. But that was an interesting thing that I got out of.
No. You went on mute. You went on mute, Julie. You're absolutely right. There's a couple of things you said there that are really interesting. It is not as big a deal in Christianity. Intermarriage historically has not been as big a deal within Christianity, primarily because in some ways Christianity can include Judaism. I mean, I don't think that's an accurate reading of it, but it can be understood that way. That, yeah, if somebody believes in one God, there still can be, even if they don't believe in Jesus, they can feel comfortable in a Jewish setting. Secondly, and I think this is probably, intermarriage isn't as big a deal demographically for Christianity as it is for Jews. Christianity is a huge majority population. So, now I don't think this is true anymore, because I think, now it used to be maybe prior to 1970, if a Jewish person married somebody not Jewish, it was as if they were leaving the Jewish community. Not everybody, but that happened a lot. Now that's not the case. A lot of interfaith families belong to synagogue, but the idea, it has never been as big a deal within the Christian community for there to be interfaith marriage as it is in the Jewish community, just throughout history. The other thing that I didn't mention that I think is very important to think about is that one way of addressing anti-Semitism is, in a sense, to be proud to be Jewish. To be proud to be Jewish. I said earlier that one of the earlier strategies for reducing anti-Semitism was assimilation, that you try not to stand out, and that actually doesn't work. People who are anti-Semitic tend to be hateful regardless. So even if you're trying to fit in, people are still going to hate you. In some ways, in terribly anti-Semitic times, how if one of the best ways to fight off a bully is to stand up to a bully, because a bully will crumple if you stand up to him. In some ways, being proud to be Jewish is a way of addressing anti-Semitism. I'm comfortable in who I am. I'm not going to try to assimilate. I'm not going to try to be who you are. And in some ways, this is kind of what happened in the former Soviet Union, that in a sense, the Jews who are actively and overtly Jewish are in some ways part of society. Like the chief rabbi and all the sort of major figures in the former Soviet Union are Orthodox. People who, now there's a lot of history behind this and so forth, but so it's not the best case example, but in general, if you try to hide who you are, it creates another kind of tension. And that being proudly Jewish and taking pride in that identity can ultimately reduce anti-Semitism. In fact, this was part of the early, I kind of said that some of the early Reform rabbis believed that assimilation would reduce anti-Semitism, but there was another strategy at the same time. When Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the founder of Reform Judaism in America, or one of the institutional founder, when he built the synagogue, the Reform synagogue in Cincinnati, Plum Street Temple, and he deliberately made sure that the synagogue was built directly across the street from the cathedral, from the Catholic cathedral, and that it was just as grand and just as, opulent as that cathedral. And the idea was that we are on equal footing here. We are proud of who we are, and we are not going to essentially be second-class citizens. Now, we can argue whether that is reflective of our values or not, maybe, but setting aside those other issues, the idea is that we are here, we are proud of who we are, and we are going to live a life affirming that. And so I think that is another way of thinking about anti-Semitism. And I think that's good. I don't believe in assimilation, obviously. I think that one of the ways we ultimately reduce anti-Semitism is by honestly saying, we're Jewish, we don't believe in Jesus, or we don't, And we're interested in learning, and we're all interested in learning. We're interested in growing. But we don't have to be like each other. We don't have to believe the same thing. And then actually, life is made more interesting when we believe different things. That's why my favorite kinds of interfaith dialogue are where there's disagreement, where there's some sort of different interpretation of a text. It's always lovely and wonderful to talk about peace and love and brotherhood and all that. That's all great. I agree with all of it, but it's kind of boring. The more interesting discussions are where there's some difference, and with respect and with empathy. You don't want to denigrate somebody, but with respect and with empathy, you say, here's what I think, here's what you think, let's talk about it. And we don't have to convince each other. We can respectfully disagree, but it's interesting to hear how somebody else looks at something. And by the way, I think we've kind of lost that in America today. Sometimes, we kind of live in silos, but that's a whole nother issue. But the idea is that ultimately, if we can live with respect and disagreement and difference, that ultimately does make the world better. Jonathan Sachs wrote a wonderful book about this called The Dignity of Difference. If you have time, I highly recommend reading it. It really is a defense of this argument that the best way of reducing hatred is to kind of be proud of who you are. Any other comments or questions? We covered a lot of ground today. Whew. Well, I wish all of you a wonderful rest of the week and a happy Hanukkah, and let the light shine bright, and see you next time.
Thanks
Bye,
so
Bye,
much.
everybody. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Terrific.
Thank you.
Bye.